I'm Flo McCormick. I'm the Special Projects Director with the Michigan Association of Counties. Many of you have seen me at some of the Brownfield Authority meetings up here in Delta County, and I'm pleasantly surprised to see so many familiar faces. It's good for all of you to come out tonight, and I really appreciate that a lot. We've got some great speakers tonight, and this program is part of an overall new initiative under the Michigan Association of Counties. We have an education and training program that we launched recently to really bring a lot of information, a lot of valuable tools to our counties, and through them to the municipalities, the businesses, and the residents within those counties. One of the things that has been a new addition to our educational and outreach efforts is an Ask the Expert program. And we will have a variety of expertise on the County Association website that MAC members will be able to access to ask questions of folks without having to spend your general fund dollars or to figure out how to pay a consultant, or in some cases, for some simpler questions, an attorney to answer. So please look to MAC first through your commissioners to find answers to some of the questions, whether it's workers' compensation, whether it's brownfield redevelopment, water resources, and as we build the program, a whole host of other sources of expertise that will be available to the members of MAC as part of their membership. We have one of our experts here tonight, well actually two from the firm. We have what we think are two of the best brownfield redevelopment firms in the state of Michigan, and I can say that because I've worked with both of them for a very, very long time. One of the firms is here tonight to help present to you a lot of good information about brownfield incentives and redevelopment tools. And you're going to hear from Eric Helzer, who recently joined AKT Peerless Environmental and Energy Services, whom I've worked with for a long time. Eric came from MEDC, and he was the guy at the state of Michigan who knew how to work with communities to develop incentives and approve those incentives. So he can bring a wealth of resources and information to you as you try to put packages together to really draw development into your communities, really pull those competitive developers in. It's a very, very tough business these days to get a new business, as you all know, and to add jobs to your community. And we've got some resources tonight to help empower you to be able to do that. If you're waiting for some magic person to fly into your community and solve all your problems, that's not going to happen. You really need to decide what you want to have, where you want to have it, and what are you willing to put on the table to encourage those businesses to locate within your communities. What incentives are you willing to offer? And how can you best put together a strategic plan for economic development that not only addresses the concerns of citizens within your community and really helps them to shape their community the way that they need to have it shaped, but also to meet the needs not only of local government, but county government and the development community itself. Our first speaker tonight is Sabina Martin. Some of you may have heard Sabina at the workshop that we held in Escanaba last September. She comes tonight from Kansas State University. She heads up the Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities program, the TAB program at Kansas State. She is a grantee of EPA. EPA gives her program money to come into communities like Escanaba or into Menominee if we have folks from Menominee. Do we have any Menominee folks? Folks from Menominee? Menominee County, that works for me. She can come into your community, and she's going to talk about the resources and tools and programs that her organization can offer. We also have Laurel Berman with us tonight, who is from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Diseases Registry, ATSDR, of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, that agency out of Atlanta that you know. Laurel heads up the Brownfield and Land Reuse Program under ATSDR. She also has a whole host of programs and tools and resources that are available for you to help figure out what your strategy is that meets the needs of your community, meets the needs of the development community, and really gets the types of businesses and economic development that you're looking for. What else she brings to the perspective of this is the public health issue. A lot of times there's a lot of misinformation going around about different properties and what might be the hazards on those properties and how people might be impacted by those. And I'm going to tell a quick story about a community in Leelanau County, very small community. If you blink, you miss the crossroads in the downtown area. It's, you know, like 6 buildings downtown. Everybody was convinced they had a high concentration of cancer occurrences in this small population, and people were convinced it was from their drinking water. They were able to use grant dollars and leverage funds from the DEQ at the state of Michigan to go in and test the wells and come to find out that the drinking water was just fine. And people for years had not used the water from their wells. That's how bad the misinformation was. So a lot of times the perception might be worse than the reality of the problem or the lack of a problem in a community because they don't have accurate information. Our goal through our education and training program at the Michigan Association of Counties is to bring to all of you, through your county commissioners, that kind of expertise that you need to help answer some of those questions that you have a tough time addressing locally. After Laurel speaks, then we're going to have Eric Holzer from AKT Peerless Environmental Consulting and AKT Peerless Environmental and Energy Services come up and talk about a site that is not unlike your waterfront areas and is something he worked on when he was at the state of Michigan. He'll show you how they applied a wide variety of tools and incentives to do the Founders Landing project up in Marquette. Has anybody seen the Founders Landing project? Great project, yep. So Eric's going to be able to talk to you about that. We really want this to be your workshop. We want you to ask questions to make it as interactive as we can and for you to get the most out of this tonight. So with that, I'm going to have Sabina come on up, and we are excuse me. We're videotaping this because we want to make it available to Delta County. They can put it up on their website. We will have it on the MAC website. And also Sabina Martin will have it on the TAB website, and it will also be on Laurel Berman's website. So you'll get some national recognition for what you're all doing as well. Sabina.
All right, thank you. To go to my assigned spot here.
Yep, go to the
that.
X.
All marked out. Oh, you know what? I need the clicker though. All right. So I only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour on what we can provide here. Just to refresh your memories, we are technical assistants to Brownfield's Communities Program out of K-State. Just also another refreshment here. What's a brownfield? I'm not sure if all of you know the official definition. That's why I put it up here. So basically, it's a real piece of property with the potential for contamination. The site does not need to be contaminated to be called a brownfield. In addition to that, it's an underutilized and blighted site. So basically, brownfields are everywhere. And depending on what sources you look at, and I just looked on the internet, basically estimated 450,000 to 1 million sites across the United States. So it's not a small problem, it's not a localized problem. Everybody has brownfields. We do a lot of these workshops, larger workshops, longer workshops, and we deal a lot with smaller and rural communities. And sometimes when they come, they say, well, I'm not really sure why I'm here because we don't have brownfields. And then they listen a little bit and hear what brownfield is about. And usually they do have brownfields. I've yet to see a community that does not have brownfields.
Can everyone hear Sabina all right? Louder, Sabina.
Okay, I'm going to yell.
Unfortunately, we're not mic'd to the room. We're mic'd to the camera.
Okay. So here's a list of brownfield examples, and I'm going to show you some pictures to go with that later, but mostly every town has an abandoned service station. That can be a brownfields. In rural areas, grain elevators, old schools, like with all this consolidation going on and school districts rebudgeting, redistricting, not enough money, that's going to be a big, big problem in the future, and it is already now. Abandoned properties next to rail lines, those can also be brownfields, and residential properties next to industrial facilities. Whoever can usually moves away as fast as possible when they do live, unfortunately, close to these kind of properties and facilities, and vacant residential lots. So I'm going to show you some pictures. This is an old gas station, probably 1920s, maybe even earlier than that. I don't know from the back if you can see that sign here. It says cold beer, but there is a lot of other stuff that got sold there, mostly gasoline, diesel. It could have been that oil changes were conducted. They were working on cars. This was probably before the time before they had regulations that, you know, they couldn't dump everything down the drain. Potentially, there could be something at the site. So plus, it's underutilized. You could call it blighted. So it is a brownfield. This thing, I need to fix that. This big mess, that's a brownfield because it's vacant, it's underutilized, it's blighted. Somebody used it to dump a bunch of trash, in quotes, that doesn't really belong there. You have this big storage tank to the side of the building. Without knowing what's going on there, you don't know what was in there. So there's a potential there for contamination. Now, how about brownfields on Main Street? Is that something that would be possible? Absolutely, because if you look at the age of the buildings, asbestos, lead-based paint, Flo was pointing out in the other previous workshop that a lot of times these folks had heating oil tanks, and they are either back in the alley or sometimes they actually are located on the side, underneath the sidewalk, on the front of the building. So there's a potential there that this building could be contaminated in the largest sense of the word. Also, if you look in the upper story, it looks like some of the openings don't have window panes anymore. Some are boarded up, meaning moisture can go in there, mold. That could be also addressed under brownfields. Now, how about this vacant lot? It's a residential area. It's in Kansas City, actually. Could that be a brownfield? Yeah, absolutely, yeah. You know, it's vacant. Just imagine the grass a little bit higher, tires there, refrigerators. We have seen that in that area. But, I mean, you really don't know what was there beforehand. What was the historic use of the site? This could have been a service station. This could have been a dry cleaner. You just don't know until you search the records and do a phase one and find out what was going on there. So yes, I mean, this is a potential brownfield site. You as a community, however, you are the ones defining what properties, what areas in your town are brownfields. This is not something that EPA will step in or the state will step in and say, hey, you got a brownfield there, you need to clean it up. Brownfields is a voluntary program and it's community driven. Here's an old school. We have a lot of those. And again, it's asbestos and lead-based paint mostly, some heating oil tanks. Some basements look like that, where you have the asbestos wrap peeling off the pipes. So why would you touch some of these properties, you know, when you could just have some developer building something on a greenfield? A lot of times, these brownfield sites are located in a desirable location, like say in the middle of a town, in a busy intersection, on Main Street, something that's accessible where the infrastructure is already there. So you don't need to put water, sewer, gas, electricity to these sites because that's already there. A lot of times when you go to a greenfield, those are the kind of incentives that are required by a company to move into your town. They want to have the infrastructure, it needs to be quick and it needs to be good. Whatever you do with a brownfield, if you go commercial or industrial, of course, you're going to create jobs and you increase the local tax base. But I think another big thing about addressing brownfields is that you get rid of blight in your community. I mean, what developer wants to, or company wants to move into a town that has a totally blighted gateway into town? And we have a lot of communities that we are helping with where just that is the case. The entryway into their town is basically not nice looking. And they're trying to fix that. And brownfields is a good way to address this kind of stuff. Obviously, when you address brownfields, you mitigate health and public safety concerns, and be it just that you have an abandoned lot with tires and rainwater accumulates in the tires. Remember, like 3 or 4 years ago, we had this West Nile scare, at least in the Midwest, Kansas, Missouri, they had that. So that's a concern you could address as little as that. All right, I'm going to give you a quick example. This is a small town in Kansas, 16,500 population, located on the Missouri River. They had a lot of blight right here along the river. There was the rail corridor. There were facilities, industrial facilities, that are now open or were open and abandoned, so it was not pretty looking. They were selected to be a stop for the sesquicentennial for Lewis and Clark. And a lot of people were expected to dock right on this stretch. And they said, well, we don't want to have our town look like that if this is the first thing that these folks see. So everything came together. It was just the right time of year and everything. So now it looks like that. They really did a very good job. They have a park, they have a trail, they have open air festivals, they have a Veterans Memorial Day. But that's just park and green space. They had a company that was ready to move away out of town because it was just, from what they said, not the right spot anymore. As soon as this development went in, when they beautified their riverfront, that company decided to stay and actually establish their headquarters there. So they gained, through this domino effect, jobs, and the local tax base obviously increased. This is, I'm not going to go through everything. I just wanted to show you what they use to make this happen. Usually not one funding source is enough to address your project. And it doesn't matter if it's a small project usually or a really big project. So when you look at this, they had DOT funding, they had money from the state, they had EPA, Brownfield's assessment grant, they went through HUD. So they had a bunch of federal and state funding resources that amounted to $2.8 million in this case. But a lot of times, communities who are in the situation of addressing brownfields forget that there is another source that could potentially contribute quite a bit to a project. Private foundations in this case, private citizens, the city per se, of course, contributed as well, and private businesses. And if you look at that, that's about close to 40% of the funding came from these sources. So if you don't ask, you don't know. You don't know what a community might be able to give, and be it just sweat equity. I mean, that's a lot too. So our program, Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities Program, it's a national program, and the best thing about it, it's free. Because we have this grant from EPA, we are able to work with communities and provide the services that we do at no charge. We are neutral. We don't have any stake in your redevelopment, and that sometimes helps a lot. We service, through our program, 10 states. That's EPA Regions 5 and 7. And on this slide, I just put down what we are asked most to do for communities. Obviously, the part that's usually missing is the money for redevelopment projects. So a lot of times we get asked, well, we have this project here, can you tell us some resources that might be applicable? And we can do that. If we are working in states that we are not that familiar with, we have contacts to the state agencies that can help out. So even if we don't know the answers immediately, we can pull everything together. A lot of times we're asked to do grant application review. We cannot write applications from scratch for communities, but we can review them and we can heavily edit. And that's not only for EPA applications, Brownfields grant applications, but for any other grant application that a community might want to consider. I put down here help finding a consulting firm. That does not mean that we say, you hire these guys, they are very good, we have worked with them in the past. That's something we cannot and will not do, but we can help a community write the request for proposal, the RFP, to make sure they get the right consultant for what they want to do. If they have never written an RFP, as I said, we work a lot with smaller and rural communities. They are very savvy at requisitioning sidewalks and office furniture and whatever else they need to do in their town. But the environmental game, that's a little bit different. And a lot of our small communities stumble across that. And if you don't have a good RFP, you don't get good responses, meaning potentially you could not get the consultant that would be really good for your project. So we can help with that. We review a lot of project plans and technical reports for communities. A lot of times we are asked to put those reports, summarize them, and put them in layman's terms, so they can take it to a commission meeting, to a board of trustee meeting, just that they're all on the same page and they all can talk about what this really means. We do a lot of community outreach and involvement, and I'll show you some slides on that later. And anything else that has to do with brownfields, basically. As I said before, if we don't have the expertise in our staff, I mean, I'm a hydrogeologist by training, we have engineers on staff, then we can go out and get the expertise. A, we're associated with a university, and B, we have a lot of contacts. So whatever is basically there for brownfields, we usually can help with. The only caveat is we're serving 10 states, first come, first serve. I mean, so far we didn't have to turn any community away, but it's always good to get in the game early. Basically, there is no application process. You call, you email, we'll see what you need, what we can provide, and that's really it. That's all it takes. So we don't need to go through that. We do a lot of workshops and training depending on what the community needs. That could be resources, that could be, well, we have a cleanup coming and we were presented with these 3 remedial technologies. Can you come in and explain a little bit more about that? Same for contaminants. Redevelopment planning, you might be familiar with Sugarloaf in Michigan. We did a planning session, a visioning session, a design charrette with them 2 years ago, where we basically invited all the stakeholders, everybody who was interested in redeveloping or seeing redevelopment at that ski resort, ski area, and they brainstormed what they would like to see there. They all got to vote on all these different ideas that were generated, and the outcome was that. That's just an example. We usually work together with a landscape architect, and that person puts whatever comes out of this visioning process into a visual rendering. In this instant, for Leelanau County, they wanted to attach this and include this into their master plan, so they didn't have a developer stepping in telling them what to do. So they wanted to set boundaries and have a framework in place for future redevelopment. Other communities use products like this to attach to their grant application, because it documents that this comes from the community, that they did community involvement, and it's not just top-down determination as to what should happen. We are very lucky with our communities. They all are very good cooks. They like to do potlucks. And what we're finding, if you really want to make sure you get a lot of people to your meeting, you're going to provide some food. I just want to briefly touch on 2 projects that we did fund with our grant funding. This is a grant writing tool that we developed. It's available on the internet for free. Anybody can use it. You have to create a username and a password for yourself. You can cooperate with others on your proposal. You don't need to be the only one writing it. We update this every year when the grant guidelines come out from EPA. We put successful grant applications from the last grant cycle on this website, so you can see how a successful grant application looks like, how they did it, what information they put in. It's very easy to do, and it's very easy to use, I should say. It's, if you know how to Google, you can use this. This one is a little bit more involved. This is our Brownfields inventory tool. You can use it for any type of site. You can upload documents, pictures, Excel files, what have you. Any site information that you deem important enough to inventory. We worked with the community ones who didn't have anything electronically. They had it all in boxes in their basement. A pipe broke, the basement flooded, and there went their records. So this is one thing that could prevent you from having to deal with such a disaster. Again, it's password protective. You create a username and a password. You can have multiple people work on this with you if you choose to give them permission, so that is possible. You can, if you have an EPA grant, you can do quarterly reports with this. That's a preset form in there that you can fill out and add to as needed. You can put your data into acres with this tool. It doesn't directly connect into acres yet. You still have to print out the form or save it and email that to them. But we're working on that one too. That might take a little bit. But it's a very versatile tool. I mean, you can, for example, you could put your site information there. You can use it. It's a huge database, and you can use it as you see fit. There are some predetermined forms in there, but you can create your own for your own output. So like say you want to log the complaints that are listed against the property that you have. You can do that with this tool. It's just whatever basically you choose to do. This is not quite as intuitive as the other tool that I showed you. And if you do have questions, we do free webinars on that. You can call us. It doesn't really matter. We'll help you out. Whatever you do, and this is my last slide before my contact information, you need to have somebody who can spearhead this effort in your community. If you don't have that person, usually nothing gets done, because it needs to be somebody who believes in this project, who has the time and energy to see it through. And you need to make sure that this person has a backup, a successor, so to speak. We work with some communities where there was a very energetic person. They just got going, they got their grants, and all of a sudden that person decides to leave, or in the other instance she got sick, and there was nobody there as a backup. So they lost all that knowledge that was accumulated basically there, and they had to start from scratch. And that puts you ways behind, especially when you're dealing with an EPA grant. The one community that we work with, they nearly lost their grant because all of a sudden there were no quarterly reports. There was no report anymore between EPA and the community. So make sure you have somebody like that can see things through and has a backup. Here's my contact information. There is also a flyer on the front table with all of our resources and contact information. If you would like to access our resources, just call or email, or even if you just have a question, we will try to help you. Thank you.
I just want to emphasize a couple of things while Laurel's coming up. She's going to be our next speaker. Sabina's services, just as Laurel's will be, as she talks about hers, are available to a community, to a township. The county can sponsor workshops and invite everyone. It can be multi-jurisdictional across county lines, however it best serves your needs. And again, these services are at no cost to you. She is a neutral person who can come in and be the facilitator for an outreach meeting or a brainstorming meeting that is as large or as small as you would like it to be. So please make sure that you think about whether or not this would be a benefit to your community and take advantage of it. And the same thing with Laurel's presentation. Some of you may remember that Laurel was also at our September workshop back in September in Escanaba. And I think we got a lot of good reaction from that as well. So I would encourage you to think about using her program too. Laurel.
Thanks, Flo. And I do recognize some of your faces from our first marathon trip through the UP in September. But I love coming up here. My mother's side of the family is from Hancock. I tend to get very exuberant about what I'm talking about, but my 16-year-old who just got her license just texted me and said, "Can I drive Nia home?" And I'm out of town. So I said yes, but now I'm wired. So that should keep me on task, all right? So she's 5 feet tall and sits on a pillow, and I'm a little nervous because we live in Chicago. But it's good. So at 10 and 5, let me know. So I work for an agency that's a mouthful. What you should remember is we're part of Health and Human Services under Centers for Disease Control. We're a federal public health agency. We do not regulate, we do not enforce, we make recommendations. And sometimes that's a really good position to be in because we just make recommendations. 80% of the time our recommendations are followed, and we make recommendations that might say you didn't take enough samples and you're not protecting public health. Take some more samples. That would be our recommendation. We've been pulled in on the Enbridge oil spill. We were at Katrina. We deploy. We do health consultations. We respond to citizens' concerns. You can petition us. That probably tells you a little bit right here about what we do. Our mandate is any site that's on the national priorities list, we need to do a health consult or a health assessment or even an exposure investigation, a health study on that site to respond to concerns about exposures and people's health. We've learned from Sabina that not all brownfields are contaminated, but there's a perception of contamination. You know, I don't know about you, but if I look at an empty lot, I tend to think it's dirty, especially if it's brown. It may not be, it may be clean, but there's often a perception of contamination associated with sites. We typically work on hazardous waste sites, but we started a brownfields and land reuse initiative. I use the term land reuse because our world is larger than those sites that are funded by EPA. We can work on landfills, RCRA, Superfund sites, and we frequently do. But we also have worked on about 500 brownfields to date, meaning brownfields that meet the EPA definition, and we work nationally. I sit in the Chicago office, my job is out of Atlanta, and there are 1.5 of me. I'm the whole person, and I have a half-time, my contemporary is half-time. Our director also does a lot of brownfields work, and then we have regional reps across the country where we're co-located with EPA. So my email automatically reverts to EPA. We get very annoyed by that because we're not a regulatory agency, we're a public health agency. So my email has a CDC ending, and I will always remind you of that. But people always say that I work for EPA. I do work very closely with them, and so do our reps across the country. And all of us can address brownfields and land reuse issues. What we do mostly around brownfields is we will do health consultation. In Baraboo, there's a Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is 45 miles northwest of Madison. There's a former manufactured gas plant site, and if we're going to look at data, we will do some technical assistance or health consultation on that site. And we partner with about 30, varies from 30 to 33 different state health departments. They apply to us for funding to do health consultation. Yours is Michigan Department of Community Health. They are excellent. Linda Dykema is the person who directs that program. Some of you may have worked with her. Our main job is to protect people and the environment from hazardous exposures. So why do we care about brownfields? Why does our agency, which gets our bread and butter from doing health consults on national priorities list sites, why do we care about brownfields? Well, what we know is that public health needs have been identified at these sites because who do you call if there's a concern with your well, or you need to get your kid vaccinated, or you think your dog or your child has ingested poison? You're usually going to call perhaps your local health department. We're like a big health department. So we get complaints and concerns brought to us about these sites. We also know that these sites drag down communities. They may not be contaminated, but if you have a vacant building on Main Street, the people on either side are probably a little bit worried about A, their business, and B, their property values. Or if you have a foreclosed home on your block. Now I work in Detroit, where 30% of Detroit is foreclosed or vacant. It drags down property values. We know that people that live in areas with multiple sites tend to have lowered health status. That is known, it's documented. We have health disparities. The main disparity that I think we can all relate to, or those of us that work in schools or have children, is our kids may have elevated blood lead levels because these areas tend to be older. The homes were built so that people could walk to work. This is before environmental regulations. We have older housing structures. And it takes about a 1/4 teaspoon of lead or lead dust in lead-based paint to poison a family of 4. So it really doesn't take a lot. So that's a health disparity that we're seeing worse off health effects in these more industrialized or brownfields areas. Also, people may not have access to recreation. I live in Chicago, where we have a lot of sites are in neighborhoods that have high crime. We don't know which comes first. Usually the sites bring more crime. People come in, they can squat in abandoned buildings or squat out in the back of industrial yards. In rural areas, they may be making meth. We have a site that was a redeveloped meth house. It's now a community center. So when you live in circumstances like that, you may be afraid to go outside. You may not have sidewalks. Your kids can't walk to school. We get lowered health status. We also know that environmental assessments, and I am not in any way picking on any environmental consultants in the room, but environmental assessments may not address public health. They don't have to. We're looking at site contamination. We're not necessarily, even though the ASTM guidance for site assessment says, maybe you want to look at who lives around there. You absolutely want to look at who lives around there, because if in a case where I live, there was supposed to be a mixed-use development in a former rail yard, and they were going to have senior housing and a mixture of uses and mixed incomes, and they said no big box stores. And guess what we got? We got a Target. And we didn't get the mixed-use development in that neighborhood. And the community organized. There was an attorney who lived in a condo, and they became a not-for-profit, a 501c3, and they went through every agency until they came to us. And they are plenty angry. And now they're living with the Target, but they didn't get what they wanted. And they were very enraged, and it created a lot of disruption of the development. They were protesting. They were taking photos of trucks of soil being taken out. And the minute one went out without a tarp, they got Illinois EPA involved. So we need to include our communities, our public health concerns when we redevelop. Even though most of us are going to be scrambling, although with Tab Easy it shouldn't be too hard to write a brownfields proposal, that proposal is going to ask you, how are you engaging your community? Who are your community groups? Who are you working with? 25% of that proposal in some years, or 20%, is going to ask, how are you protecting human health and the environment? And not only that, who are you working with? Who are your tribal, local, state, or federal health authorities that you're working with? Now, when I score proposals, because most federal agencies will score proposals, and someone says, we're working with the health department, capital H, capital D, I give them a 0. I mean, come on, who are you working with? And who are your community members, and how are you going to do this, and what's your viable plan? It's getting very competitive to get funding in this economy. So we want to really look at public health while we're writing these proposals, or while we're thinking about revitalizing, because you need that community input. You have to do outreach on your grant if you're funded, and you have to show that you have done outreach to get funded. So it's a process to be really thinking about, how are we going to improve this community. The other thing that we found, and we found this in one of the earliest projects we worked on, which was in Baraboo, Wisconsin, they allocated a little bit of money for community health monitoring. You can take 10% of a brownfields grant, assessment grant typically, but even cleanup, I believe they'll let you do this, to look at community health. Now, health monitoring, people think needles. Public health, oh, okay, vaccines. Public health means what's going to make this community feel better. It's a very broad definition. Do people have enough access to health care? Is there a building that could be a community center because there isn't one? Do children have elevated blood lead levels because of older housing stock? Are there enough jobs for people in the community? Is it an aging community? Is there a clinic? Can people get to the grocery store? Are there sidewalks? These were all issues that came up in Baraboo that have also come up in very dense urban environments. But you go to have a meeting, and this is particularly in Chicago. Blue Island is a collar suburb of Chicago, and they'd say, come to our brownfields meeting. I think you have to have 2 of those, and you have to post it in the newspaper. Well, there's 2 big mistakes that we made, and that we weren't part of the bit in Blue Island that were made. 50% of the population is Latino. They do not speak English as their first language. The other 23% of the population are African American. In your brownfields proposal, how are you going to meet your target community, and will you have a translator? You know, you need a plan. So when they'd have a brownfields meeting, 2 or 3 people would come, and one was the environmental consultant who lived down the block because he was looking for work. So they started having community health meetings, and the city would have a big spread of tables at the front of the room. They'd do health fairs, they'd have movie night in the park, and they got brownfields interspersed in these community meetings. And we actually came out, I have bloodborne pathogens training because we test kids for lead. I don't stick their fingers, fortunately. We work with the local health authority, in this case Metro South Medical Center, and we tested kids for lead. And we were able to then talk about brownfields, and we learned very quickly to have our materials be bilingual. So what happens with this is you get this healthy vision at the front end, and we think you have savings later, because if you get your community input, they might actually use the site once it's built, rather than saying, we're not going to shop at this Target because this isn't what we wanted. So you can get your support of your community. You can also leverage funds. We've worked with a lot of communities that have done a health pilot, or like Sabina talked about, that plan for the ski resort Sugarloaf. You attach that to a proposal, any kind of funding, not just brownfields. Now you have a viable plan. You've got my attention if I'm scoring that proposal. I say, wow, look, they've already done some work. Look at all their partners. And it's not a lot of effort, and you build a lot of community potential and capacity and then bring in more funding. So you get a group of people like us together, we usually know who's got some money. We have some money. We'll get to that in a minute. And sometimes you can create a good sustainable vision for that community. Sabina has said, and I've learned a lot traveling with her, I think this is our third presentation of 7. She said, you don't want another brownfield in 5 years. You want to build something that people will use. And what does this mean? Well, in a down economy, sometimes all we can do is make something better. We have highlighted communities in case studies. I'll get back on my X in a minute, Gabriel. This is a book of case studies we've done on healthy reuse of land. Sometimes all you can do is create a park. That's it. Well, there are Kaboom grants for kids' playgrounds. And what's good about Kaboom grants is you have to test for lead and arsenic in the soil. So you learn something about your community and maybe prevent exposures in your kids. So in this book we have some case studies. This is available on our web. But it shows that sometimes you don't have to have that big economic development push to make something happen. It may be just to make the community a better place to be. Again, we build capacity, and then there's some interim uses we can do. So in Baraboo, which has just done a stellar job of involving the community in redevelopment, well, the economy's not great. So the plans to build the mixed-use housing and further setbacks from the river and all the green development that they wrote into ordinances have been a little slower than people envisioned. So while the waste transfer facility that was in the middle of town near the daycare center and really stinky was relocated off of the river, so we can now prevent some exposures or runoff and odors that have impacted people in a very well-traveled area, a lot of tourists. They have this empty dirt lot where the waste transfer facility came down. So they planted alfalfa as an interim use that's being fed to local livestock. I think it's a great idea for 2 reasons. One, you're feeding local livestock and they tend to like alfalfa. The second is, well, there's 3 reasons. It's green, it smells pretty, and it looks nice rather than looking at bare earth. The third is if you vegetate a site and it does have contamination, you can trap fugitive emissions. So it's really good to put down vegetation on lots that you may not be sure of that may not have been assessed. This was assessed, no contamination. Then we could foster collaboration and creativity. I've talked a little bit about Baraboo. I'm encouraging you to do this in your community. And I'm going to mention Rutland, Vermont. If you have a notepad, jot down The Blood in This Town. It's a movie about a blood drive, but really what's most important is in that movie is it's 80 minutes. And in September at the conference, the MAC conference, we'll be showing a shortened version of this. These folks went out as volunteers and built a mountain bike park that has 16 miles of trails and has become famous in that region. And they're all volunteers. They went out with pickaxes and they started indoor and outdoor farmers markets and farming. So in the middle of winter, with no heat, you can go into one of those Main Street buildings that's abandoned. They've strung up lights and they're bartering and selling produce that's grown in hoops, so they're growing through the seasons. So all volunteers. So I'm hoping that motivates other communities as well. So what can we do? As an agency, we can get our resources into communities. I've showed you the book. We have a DVD toolkit. We try to emphasize best practices. We can provide technical assistance. You can call me. We have a funding announcement that's coming out in May or June on grants.gov. I will send it to Flo. She'll get it to you. These are for projects related to revitalization of brownfields that look at community health. And we have lots of examples of past projects, which include building a trail, using tires pulled from a watershed. One community created a recreational trail for an Hispanic community that didn't have a place to walk. So there are lots of ideas that we can give to you if you apply for this funding. The other thing is we can keep developing these community resources. That's the cover of our book. I'm writing book 2 right now. I would love to feature you in the next book if you have a project that's really exciting. Community involvement. We have an action model framework, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Risk communication. We can do risk communication or help you do that or hook you up with your local health agency or state health agency, if you have a concern about a site. They talked about the fear of elevated cancer in Cedar. We can explain what normal rates of cancer are in a population and what you need to look for. 1 out of 2 women and 1 out of 2 men and 1 out of 3 women, I believe, or vice versa, will develop cancer in their lifetime. Now, when we see something like liver cancer, and there might be a vinyl chloride factory, then we kind of get our attention perks up. But sometimes we can just explain to the community, it's okay. You know, these are normal rates in your community. We support EPA projects, we provide grants, and we'll help communities with no money and no funding. We have very little funding ourselves, so we understand. So what you can do in the interim, while you're waiting to apply for a Brownfields grant, and you're going to need to show on that grant how you're working with the community, you can use a model we have called the action model. This has been used very successfully by communities with Brownfields funding that want to look at community health, and also by communities that don't have any funding. We focus on the development community. Are some of us residents here? Just came out of curiosity? Anybody live here? Commissioners, health people, economic development people, consultants, public health, environmental. That's usually what happens when we focus on the development community. It's anybody that's interested in where they live and making it revitalized. Then we take 4 steps to assess community health status. And Sabina showed her last slide of the caricature. You need to know that this is going to happen. So in Baraboo, the city administrator drives the process, but he's working with UW Extension to make sure year after year they can keep doing this revitalization vision and keep tracking what's going on in the community. The 4 steps that I talked about previously, this 4 steps to assess community health status, very simple. What are the issues in the community? We just start with a group like this and we brainstorm. How can redevelopment or revitalization address those issues? What is the corresponding health benefit? And then what data are needed to measure change? That 4th point is critical. We create community-driven indicators of overall community health status. These could be things like, how many health fairs have we had? How are the sidewalks? How many farmers markets are there? What is water quality? What is the air quality here? What is the age and condition of housing? What is our crime status or crime rates? And then over the course of redevelopment, we can track those. In Baraboo, 1/3 of 33 of those types of measurement indicators showed a change for a positive within 1 year. Now that looks great when you're applying for a grant. You can just pick that up and stick it in an application. I don't care who it's for. You have a good chance. It's kind of what that looks like. Because we're all scientists, we like to work in Excel, so we put everything into tables. But it's also a good way to just pick that up and paste that into a grant. And we have plenty of examples of the action model on our web page, which is in your resources sheet. So what can you do? Part of what you can do if you already have funding or if you're thinking of applying for funding, like we said before, you have to know what you're going to do with sites. The TAB program has the BIT, the Brownfields Inventory Tool, and here we have the Site Inventory Tool, very similar, a little more health-based. You can look at exposure issues with a site. So if you're working with a consultant, you know that a site is next to a nursing home or a daycare center where we have our more sensitive populations, you might prioritize that site for something you want to look at. You can paste records in, you can import, export, put it into GIS. We also have a dose calculator in there, which I had explained earlier. If you have some contamination data, soil sample data, or maybe lead in soil, you can run the numbers to see who's being exposed and how often. Why we inventory sites is to see what we can do with them. In Blue Island, where there's 400 sites in 4 square miles, the whole city is practically a brownfield. They're looking for those sites that are, maybe not as high a priority in terms of risk, that could be tot lots or urban gardens. They've started 4 gardens. And in a community that has limited access to full-service grocery stores, that's a great thing. They're growing food. They're thinking about starting an orchard. Oh, it saves money, too, if you kind of get started on this. It's easy to use. I talked about the dose calculator already. It's free. We support this, so we'll do a webinar Or if we have money to travel, we'll travel to you, we'll train. We're planning to do a training on this at MAC if it gets accepted. And again, it can save some of your grant money because your consultant can use it and we'll support it. We have consultants. We have someone in Romania who's using this. It's an occupational medicine physician. But we have consultants call us and we'll tailor the tool to your needs. What you can do, integrate health. It may seem like it's overwhelming because you're already trying to apply for funding, but it really looks good on paper and your community will be a lot happier if they feel included. And then you can integrate all of these resources. This is how you can reach me. I usually answer my phone unless I'm in the UP. And with that, I'll close out. I know we're going to have some site examples and more time to talk. So thank you very much.
Should we keep rolling? Yeah, I think we should.
Couple quick breaks back here.
Quick break?
Quick break.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Okay.
If you want a 5-minute break. Feel free to talk with Laurel and Sabina and even Eric. You haven't heard Eric speak yet, but feel free to go ahead and talk with him as well. Oh no, you're all right. Okay, very good.
I knew there was something wrong someplace. I like blaming him anyway.
Oh, you be nice.
Yeah, you want to get on. I'm the authority now.
Oh, no, I think it's here. No, actually, I have a slide.
Okay. I'll add to that.
And then there's Eric's presentation for tomorrow.
Is that for Alger as well?
Let's see, we're talking about algebra, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I already had this one. Actually, I had this one from Flo, and then Eric just gave this to me earlier today.
Where's the agenda for Alger?
Let me see if I've got that one. I do. It's probably tab ATSDR.
TIF from Eric with challenges and options to labs. Okay, I want to add some stuff to that.
Let me see. So you need me to either, do you need me to email that to you or just put it on a flash drive for you?
You could lend me a flash drive.
Yeah, I think I can do that. Let me see. I just want to check here. This is what I had for pictures. That's what I thought. Which I didn't even think to show us. You could have used those if you want. Okay. Let me see if I've got a flash drive I can clean out for you. I think I did.
Quite a while ago, I did Yep. Is it over by the office? Yes, yes. I talked to that guy. You didn't send me. Well, I did read something. From the 2 to the 3. They're better, but percentage lost. The 2 is if you could live with. Because if it's in the city, what can consider a star
Just let me check and see if there's anything where that.
I want to add it, so I'd like to use Eric's format as a TIF.
Just got back from vacation. Well, no,
earlier, and I was thinking it would be nice just to jot some of it. Yeah, yeah. I'm kind of a passionate people. Right, then I'm not a grade 5. I didn't talk to you guys. So that's, but on my computer, I know it's right.
So this is just for your mic.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I have no problem with that.
Yeah, you do good. The gentleman who's sitting on the end
Can I keep
here.
this in my pocket? Is that
Sure,
okay?
yeah. The gentleman who's sitting there is on the bottom. The guy in the plaid shirt is the other kind.
Oh, great. You got a great turnout here today. This is awesome.
That's what it is. Stephen King and this one.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, no, this is great.
The guy in the suit is Pete.
Okay.
He's on the Delta County Brownfield Authority.
I don't know, is my mic hot? It's in my pocket now.
Don't make any rude noises. All right, we're going to get started again because we have a lot to do and a lot to get through, and I want to make sure you have plenty of time to ask questions of everybody, especially hearing the things that Eric has to say. Eric's really going to talk about pulling a lot of the funding and resource and strategic pieces together to make projects happen. As I said earlier, we are videotaping this, so if you have a question, I'm going to do my best to run over and hand you the microphone so that we can hear your question and make sure we get it recorded. If I don't make it in time or you don't want to talk into the microphone, I'm going to ask Eric and everybody else up here to repeat the question so that everybody can hear it. Eric.
Hi. Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself so you can get an idea where my perspective is. And when I'm going through this presentation at any time, please stop me. I was told early on in my career when I started doing presentations on incentives to treat people like fifth graders. And you know, it's not that you have the attention span of fifth graders, but you know, I can't assume you know everything that I'm talking about. And it's real important that you understand the basics. And so I'm going to show you some examples in different ways to try to kind of set a message to you, and especially about tax increment financing. That's the major part of what I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to show you a project that really leveraged it. And then intertwined with that, I'm going to talk about a number of incentive programs, primarily with the state of Michigan. There are some federal programs that I'll touch on and how they interrelate with tax increment financing, and how Brownfields in Michigan really is, in my opinion, is probably one of the strongest states with a Brownfield program. We have a tool here that has been copied and duplicated many times over. Our programs have been looked at quite a bit, and even with the lack of funding that we've had in the downsizing of our state government, you know, there was a lot of talk about incentives that have, you know, there's not a Brownfield program anymore. Well, that couldn't be really farther from the truth. What we've lost is a particular incentive called the Michigan Business Tax Credit, or Brownfield Credit. And that wasn't the entire program. The reason everybody talked about it, it was very easy to explain and get your head around. You make a certain amount of investment and you get a percentage of that investment in the form of a check at the end of your project. It was as simple as that. So you had an eligible investment that you would go to, and it was low-hanging fruit. So the tax increment financing program I'm going to talk to you about today, even though it was there all along, it hasn't changed, it hasn't gone away. In fact, it's been improved upon since 1996 the program was started, and you know, here we are in 2012. So a lot of positive things have happened with it. One thing to let you know, everything I'm going to talk about is in the process, though, of being amended currently. There's legislation right now going through. They're trying to get it passed before the summer break. That is going to change our Brownfield tax increment financing program. I think for the better. It's going to allow for more eligible activities, greater than what we have on our table today. However, the negative is a lot of those activities that they're going to be adding to it are going to only be allowable in core communities. And they may even redefine what core communities is. And I'm not so sure how the legislative body is going to take to that. So that'll be interesting to kind of watch as it moves through the next couple of months. I started in this program as a civil and environmental engineer. Quickly, after a short period of time, got into Brownfields in the mid-90s, actually worked on the initial legislation. Worked as a consultant, private consulting doing that. And then I went to another dark side and became a developer and worked with development companies across the state with specific handful of development teams, redeveloping not only just brownfields but development in general, not only in Michigan but in many other states in the nation. Then we had the decline and the downfall of with the economy and the financial institutions, and I saw a lot of the projects that I was working on, which were quite substantial. We were trying to save every deal we could possibly do, and that was just not in Michigan, but that was elsewhere in the United States. So one thing I didn't do was work actually in government, and so then I joined the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. They had a position open, and I became the Brownfield program leader, and I was there for about 3 years, and then I left and went back to consulting. And I've only been back in consulting now for about a year. But I'm really glad to be back. I really enjoy working with communities and taking all of the tools that we have before us to assemble. And that's really the critical thing. There's not one particular project that's exactly the same, and they all use the tools differently and how they're applied. And there are many tools. So I'm only going to touch on a few. I'm going to go through these initial slides kind of fast because some of it's repetitive, but I want you to understand what I'm talking about with the TIF and then how we applied it to a very major site in Marquette, Michigan. In general, what we're doing is we're leveraging, okay, on the new property tax revenues. That's really what we're taking, and we're actually applying those new revenues into a project. The site or the area is really what we're looking at, so it takes specific sites. It's a planning tool to address underutilized or underperforming sites. You have to meet certain criteria in order to fit into this particular program. But in Michigan, our program is a lot stronger, and I'm going to go into the details on this because it's much broader than most of the states in the nation. But you hear in government all the time the but-for clause. This is one of those programs that you have to say to yourself, you can't use it, or we're going to need to use it if it wasn't for this program. This development wouldn't occur but for this program. And we have to always look at that. And so we go to the conditions of a site, whether it's contaminated or not, blighted, functionally obsolete, it doesn't matter. Just to talk about the differences, often when I talk about TIF, everyone kind of thinks DDA TIF. It's very similar. It's the closest program. There's many other programs. This is not a TIFA, a tax increment financing authority. So don't Google TIFA ever. Michigan doesn't follow that, the TIFA. There are TIFA districts still existing in Michigan, but this is not a TIFA program. You have DDAs that function very similar to BRAs, but the distinction is that they're only capturing the local revenues, where brownfields are able to capture the state revenues. And with DDAs, there's an opt-out provision or opt-in provision. With brownfield authorities, you do not have that opt-in, opt-out. So that is really the distinct difference. The other thing is that the TIF districts may not capture any debt obligations, okay, or the state education tax. That's really important. Now, brownfield can capture that state education tax. So where you see here, it just explains that distinction. So the brownfield is able to capture all available for, in general practical purposes, all general specific taxes. In which makes the program very powerful without that opt-out and opt-in provision. Another way to look at it, kind of putting them side by side, just so you can get the idea with that. This is a really important piece of the tool. Does anybody have any questions on this? I'm not going to drill down much deeper than this, but this gives you the general overview. Now, the difference between a brownfield and how a property qualifies within a DDA versus a brownfield underneath a brownfield authority is that it's site-specific or project-specific with a brownfield. With a DDA, it's a district or area, okay? Now, for those communities, and some of you may have been around and doing brownfield work, maybe as long as I have, but there used to be a district or area-wide designation with brownfield. That ended in 2001 because the problem is that the legislation, they did not contemplate these programs once they're put in place, the brownfield TIF, lasting greater than 30 years. So there's no amendment for an extension in time. DDAs, you can extend. You can amend those DDA districts and areas and extend in time. So if you have a designated DDA that's 10 years, you can go back out, go through the same process. It's very difficult, but you can extend that. So what they had ended up doing here is defining it to a specific site. So when they amended the legislation in 2001, that's how they coined it. Now, there's definition of eligible activities and eligible expenses, and that is a distinction. There's certain designated expenses that's governing body driven. So depending on which community you're in a DDA district, it's going to change from one district, one community to another. With brownfield, that's stagnant. It's the same everywhere. with the exception of core communities, which I'll get into in a section. Now, opportunity. When we have a brownfield within a DDA, that is when we have a greater leverage of opportunity on a project. And we only use that tool if we really need to go that route. Because the DDA is already capturing the local revenues, we are able to, in a brownfield situation within a DDA, then capture the state revenues. So that's an additional way to qualify a site and to get additional revenues into the project.
Eric, can you talk about a situation where the DDA and a Brownfield Authority might enter into a cooperative agreement to share some of those local taxes for getting a project done?
That's a good question. Working on a project right now. It's inside the DDA, and they ended up, they're doing mainly infrastructure improvements, okay, within the DDA. That's primarily what they're targeting. The problem is that when you get into infrastructure, as most of you know, it's very expensive. And the local revenues generally are not enough. Or you're in a small community or a small district, and it doesn't matter how many projects you're leveraging, you can't develop enough revenue to pay for those expenses. So if you have a brownfield site, and that brownfield site can benefit from those public infrastructure improvements, and in my example, if you're inside of a core community, okay, so here in the case of the city of Escanaba, you can do that. We can now approach the state for the 24 mills. And we can, so long as the site is a brownfield site, it's going to benefit from that public infrastructure that's surrounding it. So the greatest and the easiest example is a parking deck. So when you're in a downtown where parking's at a premium, and in many communities that is a premium, they're expensive. I've not seen many decks below about 15 million. In general, I'd say that's about the lowest number of, and then the decks that I'm working on right now. It's about a 200 to 250 spaced deck, and it requires the state support in order to pay off that obligation. And another reason that we do it inside of a brownfield is we can incur debt obligations or bonds, and a brownfield authority can go after that bonding. And generally, we look at tax-exempt bonds if we go through the authority and we get the full faith and credit of the community. And then we can generally leverage a lot more and get low interest. Another reason we do that is the state will participate then in the interest. They'll actually pay for that interest up to 5%. Right now, we're getting bonds between 3.5% and about 4.25%. So depending on the community that we're in. And so that's really another great advantage, is now we get the state participating to pay off the interest. So. Some key terms that you're going to hear, and I'm going to kind of start to transition out of DDA and into brownfield primarily. You have authority. They're both authorities, DDAs and brownfields. Then you have a district or eligible property, that distinction between the two. And then the main thing here is captured value. Brownfields, we're only after that incremental increase, that new value that's created, that from the base value that was there. So in my example, I'm going to show you a couple different ways. I'm going to build upon this example as I go through my slides. But we have initial taxable value of $300,000. We have a new taxable value of $1 million. That captured is that delta, that $700,000. We need a development plan. There has to be a viable project at the end of this. This just can't be a concept. The only way these revenues are generated is if the project is completed. And that is something that's missed sometimes. It has to be built before we can actually expend these funds. And then it's on the specific taxes. So in my example here, here's the base. The new value is made on the property. It's then reassessed, and we have this new increment that we can go after. So that base down there, that's going to remain the same. And as you can see in this next slide, I'm building on the same example. This tax every year continues to go to all taxing jurisdictions. It is not touched. So the premise being on a brownfield site, it's sitting there vacant, it's abandoned, it's generating minimal tax. It's going to be like that for perpetuity unless somebody comes in and takes on all those challenges and they invest the new money. And so this base, the idea is we're going to continue giving to the taxing jurisdictions every year that same amount of money as if that site was never developed before. And then we come in and we are capturing on an annual basis this $700,000. Now in my example here, I assume 5% increase per year. And I'll tell you, we have a lot of upside down plans, downstate especially on projects. We had property values going up as much as 14% a year. And so they were writing brownfield plans in some communities, and they were assuming, you know what, this gravy train is going to last forever, 10, 12%. I've seen brownfield plans written like that. And then in 2008, the bottom fell out. It's 2012. Those communities, the values are lucky if they're stabilized by now. And they're actually backwards. It takes more to construct a lot of these buildings in certain communities, all right, than they're worth today. They can go build that new building, and it's going to be, when the minute it hits the tax rolls, it's actually worth less. And it's a shame. There's certain communities downstate, it's still pretty dismal. And so you have a lot of upside down plans. This is going the opposite way. It's actually below. So this is another way to show you over this same period of time. And in this particular one, here's my tax rate. And it shows you what the taxes on an annual basis and the amount after this many number of years, so here from 2012 to 2016, that $81,000 that they would have been getting, whether that site was developed or not, is still going to the taxing jurisdictions. And then annual taxes that are captured, that's that incremental increase. That goes to pay off eligible activities, the cleanup activities or the demolition, and I'm going to get into that now. So here's another way to look at it. After, so here we are in 2017. Expenses have been paid off. We've captured all the revenues we need to pay off those expenses. Now we have a positive annual return of $49,000 a year versus what we had before, which was about $16,000 a year in my example. Now this is a very simple example, very small site, small investment. All right, here's that but-for clause that I was talking about before. You go take a greenfield site. You go out and walk out to a greenfield. You're not going to have any of these expenses up here. You're not going to have the underground storage tanks. You're not going to have to do special foundations. That is huge on a brownfield site, most often overlooked. And in my example project I'm going to show you, that was critical to getting the project developed. So all of these things right here are not typical on a greenfield, but they are on a brownfield often. This is actually a real project. So the cost of construction in my example is $14,000. That's the same, but here's those incremental increases in costs. So we have an additional $1.1 million in this project that's got to be covered. Well, guess what? Banks generally don't finance that. They generally don't look at this. They're looking at this right here, that construction number. They might take care of some of the special foundations, maybe part of the demolition, but generally they're not going to look at the rest of that. And so we have this gap. And a lot of our programs, and the programs I'm not going to touch on today, there are programs within the state that will help meet that gap. Two of those programs, one's called the Community Revitalization Program, the other is called the Business Development Program. They're a grant loan program. They're the programs that have replaced the Brownfield MBT credit here in Michigan. And that whole program is addressed to meet this gap. So instead of giving credit on investment that's being made, the state has said, you know what, we're going to focus our energy on addressing this gap. We're going to help bring deals to the banks to help make them financeable. So really that's the premise of the new programs. So in my example project, we now have this gap of $1.1 million. Construction occurs of $14 million. There's a new tax bill, okay, that's sent out recognizing that new investment. The developer pays that tax bill as he would normally pay that. This is not an abatement program. It's often confused. I'm going to mention that again. I have that often come to me. It's not a property tax abatement or a personal property tax abatement. There's nothing there. The tax bill is sent out like normal and paid like normal. And then incremental increases in tax per year are captured. So here's a look at that increment and then how we are paying off that gap. So On an annual basis, this base taxable value in this example was $287,000. The new recognized taxable value, investment was 14, so I'm assuming 50%. The new taxable value is $7 million. So they're able to capture this captured value, $6.7 million. Well, that results in new taxes of about $273,000 annually. So you take that and you just simple division, you divide that into your gap, and you come up with a number of years that it's going to take in your revenue schedule. And it looks simple here, and it is at the end of the day. This is what everyone looks at. There's very detailed revenue schedules. We have to go through every one of the millages. We have to verify everything. If it's inside of the DDA, what part's the DDA getting, what part's the Brownfield getting. There's agreements, multiple layer agreements that are usually placed upon between the developer and the community, between them and the authority, if there's a DDA involved with the DDA, and then God help you if it's in a land bank, and then we have that component as well. And so that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But it makes our job very, very complex, and we have to stay on our toes when we do that. But it is as simple as this. At the end of the day, that's what you're looking at. How long is it going to take to capture those new revenues generated to pay off that gap? So how can it be used? This is really kind of a cool way to use TIF. The traditional way is the developer funds this out of their own pocket. And in today's economy, that is very difficult to do. So they're looking for another source of funds often to come up with paying for that. There's grants. We talked about some of these here through the EPA. There's DEQ grants as well. But more importantly, there's more loans. And more of the agencies are pushing toward loans. And why the loans are effective and more people are looking at that is that it can be used to TIF that work. All right? So you take any one of these loans, you use that in a normal fashion. Interest is also reimbursed on that. You obtain that loan and then use tax increment financing to meet that debt obligation that's on there. In Michigan, if we're going to use the Brownfield, it doesn't matter what program we use here, whether it's federal or state as a loan program, environmental and non-environmental. Most states have this, the environmental. They don't have the non-environmental. There's two important documents that everybody needs to be aware of when they get into this. There's a Brownfield plan that establishes the eligible property and that defines the project. And basically that's there in order to capture tax increment revenues. If you want the use of the state revenues, you have to write an Act 381 work plan. And that is the only time that you write that second document. So many people think that they have to write this. But you can do local only plans just like a DDA would without the state revenues. However, in today's economy, most projects that we're looking at involve them. Some definitions: facility, that just means a contaminated site. Blighted, one thing to highlight, I underlined it here, subsurface debris. And so many sites, that was a new amendment in the last round of amendments to legislation. If it has subsurface debris, huge on waterfront redevelopment. I can't tell you the number of sites that are not contaminated that have subsurface debris, just because they're filled lands, they're bottom lands, they're lowlands. Just 100 years worth of industrial use, and it could just be wood, but it's not buildable in its present state. That can blight a site. Functionally obsolete, we talked about that a little bit. Basically, it was designed for one purpose, and it cannot be used any longer for the other. And then in Michigan, we are able to pull in adjacent and contiguous parcels to any one of these designated qualifying criteria. And that helps expand the project. But it has to be part of that project. And there's a way we go through that. If you want environmental funds, it has to be contaminated. These are the activities. Generally, it's all your due diligence work. It's your due care, which basically means we need to make sure it's safe for human health and the environment. And it pays for those due care obligations in order to reuse that site safely. And then there's additional response activities. That's mainly your cleanup activities. For the MEGA eligible property qualifications, MEGA is the non-environmental. Michigan Economic Growth Authority through MEDC. That was the program that I had worked on. And within the it can qualify as either facility, functionally obsolete, or blighted. So if it's just contamination and just environmental activities that you're after, it has to be a contaminated site. If you're looking at non-environmental activities, which are these here, demolition, then asbestos abatement, and skip down, infrastructure improvements in core communities, and site preparation in core communities, it does not have to be contaminated. Very important distinction. And that is statewide. It can be blighted or functionally obsolete. The important thing to note, there's in guidelines that were amended 3 years ago, we redefined demolition for non-core communities. And here's why. Very important, because most of the communities in the Upper Peninsula are non-core. A lot of sites have, if the site was demoed, they left their foundations, for instance, or their basement systems might be there, and then they are just backfilled on them. Well, the prior interpretation of the legislation is that it had to be a demolished site. It's like magic. I think there is a switch somewhere. It's all right. You're going to need the screen for the next pictures. Is it that on the wall by chance?
It's just
I don't know. It's okay. I can talk a second here. But as far as demolition goes, on site demolition, we define it as it can be an entire building, part of a building, or interior of a building. Because so many of our sites are not contaminated, but they're functionally obsolete or blighted. So you can do a complete gut job on a building to help prepare it for redevelopment. You can tear off a roof. You can tear off a wing of a building. Or if you have a vacant piece and we have to deal with all the subsurface debris and former foundation systems, or there's old utility lines and they're abandoned in the site, it looks nice from the surface. But that adds a tremendous amount to cost, especially in a small redevelopment. Any community in the state can go after the site demolition piece. And so that's 100% eligible. Here we go. Did you figure it out?
I did.
Awesome. It's a touch screen. I thought it was a touch screen. All right. The TIF is really a go-to program now in the state. Again, like I said, a lot of the programs with the decline of financing. It is really the only guaranteed financing mechanism that we have. It is something that is controlled locally. It is yours to manage and handle. And if you want to have the state participate, then you prepare that work plan and you can ask for their assistance. The Brownfield TIF is also the only, I have never worked with one program other than TIF. It's a standalone program that can address all brownfield needs, all brownfield gaps. And many of the other programs, whether it's grants, loans, you name it, credits, abatements, tax deductions, they only cover a portion of what the Brownfield TIF can cover. So it really is a go-to program. And the key is to layer it. We got no signal here. What is this? Oh, they turned that on. That you're gonna have to hit that off. There you go. I think we're good, but I think I got a blue screen on top of my screen. Do you see something that says projector?
No, I don't. I see fixed image.
He'll grab it. We can go through it. All right. I'm going to go through, I got about 5 minutes. I'm going to go through this site quite quickly. It's mainly pictures, just to give you an idea. I had the opportunity to work on this when I was at the state. The developers actually came to us because they couldn't make the numbers work. The site has sat after the city had spent many millions of dollars in addressing the cleanup on this magnificent waterfront. This particular waterfront was a complete separation of the downtown in Marquette from Lake Superior. It was about 3,600 linear feet on 29 acres, over 150 years of industrial use and abuse, and as you will see. Everything from a rail yard, bulk petroleum, Had every kind of petroleum product you can imagine on this site, including in caustic soda, which these numerous spills actually shut the facility down, and which really put this into a brownfield state. Vehicle and ship maintenance, coal storage, and then amount of bottomlands that were filled in, which, as you see here, actually created, after the environmental cleanup was done, you guys are great. Actually did, yeah, you did, that's right. I don't have the blue on there anymore.
That off and the screen down. We have our own projector, so we need that big projector to stay off, and we need the screen to come down.
We can live with the blue if we have to. That's my 7-year-old daughter. She just hits buttons and it just works. Don't be afraid. Just start pushing buttons.
We're taking turns.
So anyhow, this last release that shut down this particular property was a sodium hydroxide spill, or caustic soda. It was on the lakeshore. Not only did it go into the soils and leach into the groundwater, but a significant amount of it, over 200,000 gallons, actually went into Lake Superior. Well, it sunk quite quickly. It is there today under many feet of sediment over the period of time. This particular area in Lake Superior is a deep water port. As you will see from the photos here, ships could pretty much come up within 10 feet of shoreline. And we're talking some big freighters that will hold all the iron ore. Is this your backup?
You bet.
Low tech. Hey, it works.
I'll have to get somebody down here, see if anybody else knows.
We're almost done. So we'll just use our screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're okay.
Yeah. They never schooled us on any of this stuff down here. So.
Oh, there it goes.
No,
It's ready now.
Okay.
So projector and screen.
See, when I made the projector come down, I hit that. The projector came down. I didn't know how to get rid of the blue screen. I was assuming that if we turned projector off,
Yeah, I think so.
no,
Yeah.
then your screen went up and everything went away.
Oh.
We're good to go.
And we have no. We'll see. We'll see. Let's just wait a minute. We got to give a second.
Yeah, just wait. Absolutely.
I think we're good. Sorry, we're making him work for his money.
It'll be on YouTube for your enjoyment at a later time.
I won't let this go too far.
Yep.
We'll put it like that.
Okay, now we got something else going. Or is that Gabriel? No, that's Gabriel. Okay. All right, thanks.
There you go. Cool. Thank you. All right. Just to give you a little orientation where we're at here, main part of downtown Marquette is here, and it's all of this lakeshore. This is the existing city marina and open space. That's here. So you can see a very large parcel property. The yellows, they took the property and broke it up into 3 distinct pieces. The other color that has been, left is called Founders Landing, and that's all public space. This is a very important photo to kind of ingrain in your mind, and you'll see later as we go through the photos. This is now the current edge of the lake shore, okay? All of this here, well, you'll see in the photos, has been filled in. It was actually filled in by the Marquette Fire. before they turned everything to stone, when everything was wood. It got put here, okay? Was not discovered until really this site started getting developed because it was so deep there, that deep water port. I don't know how much volume of soil they actually had to put in there.
How long ago was it?
This shot was 1870. Yeah, I like the cannon with the little guy arming it there and standing by. 1931, as you can see, they're building this new ore dock. Intensive rail use is coming into and along the lakeshore. 1950, rail use even more prominent, and heavy amounts of petroleum usage all along the lakeshore. You can see that ore dock again, completed there in the background. 1960, still there. More intense use, a lot larger tanks. And then this was in 2001 and 2, I believe. The city, after the shutdown of all the releases, they were successful in acquiring the property, and they acquired all of the lakeshore. They did this through a combination of grants and general bond obligations that they actually went out on their own to do. It was a pretty gutsy move. Several city officials lost their jobs over this, including a city manager, from what I understand, because they put the city in a very tight financial position. But as you can see here, a tremendous cleanup with help from the DEQ, a large development grant. And they pretty much were excavating, it kind of looks familiar location, if you can kind of put your perspective, in that same location that I showed you where that was all filled in. And that's where they had the bulk fueling facilities located at. And then after they removed all of the soil, they did not dig all that deep. They couldn't, they were limited in their funds. They removed the gross contamination from the site. And again, they went right to that shore edge that you saw in that picture where that little boy was arming the cannon. This is that area. Primarily, this is parcel 3 of the bulk fueling facility. And here it is as seeded and strawed. And here's an aerial shot. It shows you, I didn't number these parcels, but parcel 2 is here, parcel 1 is in the middle, parcel 3 is in the north. And then the city put all this infrastructure in, again, on their own dime. Everything I'm showing you right here was 100% eligible for tax increment financing. If they would have put this project, and the legislation was sitting there, if this project would have been placed into a brownfield plan, all of what you see here would have been reimbursed once the developer came on the property. They could have TIF'd this, they could have parked it, they could have kept track of their expenses, and when the developer, they sold the land, the city would have been first in line to get that all reimbursed. But they didn't do that. It was, again, done in different fashion for financing. Did a complete restoration of a creek that flows right through the middle of this parcel. This thing was encased, covered up, and they exposed it, reopened it. So in 2008, the Landing Development Group acquired the first parcel, and then the next year, the very next parcel. And they came up with this concept plan. So this, they did not acquire parcel 2, which is over here. They acquired parcel 1 and parcel 3. Very dense development, mixed-use development. They wanted to extend the city, basically natural progression, extend what was in downtown Marquette, bring it all to the waterfront. This is parcel 3, focused on it. Hotel sitting here out by the water's edge. Where those this is all where the bulk fueling facilities were located. And these are all very large, multi-story mixed-use buildings. Here's a perspective. You're sitting, this is pretty much at the city level when you come into Marquette. It drops off 4 stories as you get toward the lakeshore. So these buildings drop off accordingly with it. They've allowed view corridors, and you can actually maintain views over the buildings in many of the locations when you're in downtown Marquette because of the way the hill is and it slopes down. Future marina is proposed. The important thing to note here on this waterfront is, and you'll see, there was the old ore docks where they had actually cut the large timbers, okay, that were out there. Those, what we've maintained, and we've gone in, and I'm fortunate now that I'm in the private sector, the developer actually sought me out and Now I'm working for the development team, probably for the next 10 years, hopefully, because it's a very large project. And I'm working with them to amend their plans and work through all of the issues that they have to deal with the site. But they're going to reuse all of these pilings that are going out into Lake Superior. So we got re-permitted for those, working with the Army Corps and the state of Michigan to maintain those agreements until we can build that marina out. This is a view from the city. The city's behind, my back's to the city here. And this is a cutaway, actually. This is a glass atrium that's cutting through this development. And this is a cut through of that to give you a sense of, at street level, you got 3 stories here, and we have underground parking. It's not really, it's actually open air parking, because as you go down, everything's exposed, but it's under these buildings, hidden from the city, so you don't see it. And then on the other side of it, at the lake, back again is to the lake, you're looking up into the development. Concept plan for parcel 1, which is primarily residential units. Parcel 1, parcel 3 is at the other end. All right, getting to the numbers just real quick. The DEQ at the time, this is now 3 years ago, it was estimated for environmental work that needed to be, it was remaining yet after the many, many millions of dollars that have been spent here. There was about another $1.6 million just in environmental work that was needed yet because of the development plan. It was designed around. So we look at all the site conditions that are remaining yet, and because this is a heavily residential, mixed-use development, there was additional work that still needed to be done to make the site safe. Non-environmental work, primarily focused on stabilizing the site. We had about almost $1 million in special auger cast pilings because of that fill that you saw on the lakeshore, that whole, the bottomlands that were filled in. We have since amended this plan. This is more than doubled in our foundation costs. This was a tremendous hurdle to the development, and this tends to be the case. I haven't seen one waterfront redevelopment site that didn't have a special foundation situation. It's quite common, whether it's a river or a lake, especially in these old industrial sites. Public infrastructure, still a huge component. The main piece that you see here, a public parking deck. So this particular parking deck is a lot smaller deck, integrated into the site. There's off-site parking with the DDA and built into it. Now what you don't see in here that's baked into the parking deck numbers, these are raw costs for construction, is actually the cost of carrying that, the bond obligations and the interest associated with it. That's down here. So you look at principal costs of activities of $19 million, we're getting another $11 million on top of that to pay for all the interest. So very powerful program. It now is financing, so we can go to a bank, we can incur debt, bonds if needed, in order to complete this project. So this was actually what was approved, $30.5 million for the non-environmental, and we're revising the environmental right now. State's participating in this at a tune of about $14 million. So it's well under construction. If you haven't been there, they're a year ahead of schedule. If you look at the residential units, and if you can remember that concept plan, pretty much built out the way they had planned. They have that next building 100% pre-sold. I think it's 18 units. And they have started construction already on that building that is off the screen. It's quite nice. Hotel is a lot farther. I took this back in the fall, and it will be complete this summer, the hotel that's on the waterfront there. So you can see another shot of parcel 3. That's where that hotel right here, oops, right here is located there. And then right here you can see there's what's included in this is a lot of public open space. As you saw in that earlier drawing, a lot of park space, trails, public trails, and so forth. Along with this, this is a public marina. This is not going to be private, by the way. This is another financing thing that's been included into this as public infrastructure, and another thing that was approved by the state of Michigan, so we have their state support on that. But part of the boardwalk is completed already. The hotel, where you see the fence, is under construction right here. And now you can actually walk here now and walk around 360 around the construction. It's actually kind of cool. The city wanted that. They wanted to see what's going on, and this was a very important piece. We had to get this done by July, by the 4th of July events. It was a push, but it got done. So thank you. I think I went 5 or 8 minutes longer, but we had a little technical difficulty there, so thank you very much. If you got any questions?
Anybody have any questions? Dave, let me get you the mic. Hang on, hang on.
This picture? Yep.
In that picture there, what are you going to do with that ore dock in the background?
You know, I think it's pretty cool, actually. There's been a lot of discussion and plans with it. The problem is it sits out in the lake, and they're having difficulty with the state of Michigan and use. You cannot sell goods. You cannot operate a business. There's some weird laws. I think there's going to need to be some special legislation written for that ore dock. I don't think there's any other way to use it. It's structurally sound. They want to keep it. There's plenty of space, plenty of ability to get out there. But the way our laws are set up, you can't use it. It is. It is. Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Good.
Well, I encourage you to take advantage of the folks who were here tonight. They're available to answer your questions. They're available to come and help you do some strategizing. And their services are either as part of the Ask the Expert program through MAC. They're happy to come and do presentations like this. And one of the things that Eric and I were talking about earlier is having him do some webinars for us on the Michigan Association of Counties website. So those would be available for folks to access as well. Sabina and Laurel, happy to come, help you do some strategic planning as well. And also always, don't hesitate to contact the Michigan Association of Counties, and we're happy to come and do workshops like this for you to kind of help you figure out what some other communities have done and how they've managed to accomplish their goals without having to reinvent the wheel all the time. So it's really good to see familiar faces again, and thank you all so much for being here tonight, for sticking through our technical difficulties, and we hope you found the workshop helpful, and send us any questions you might have and we'll be happy to help you. Thank you.